Hello, welcome along. Very, very welcome to the Prevention is the New Cure podcast. We're discussing all things NHS and health related with a political twist. I'm Steve Bryan. I'm the MP for Winchester in Hampshire. I'm the chair of the Health and Social Care Select Committee in the House of Commons.
And I'm Helen Stokes-Lampard. Now, I'm a GP, a frontline GP in the Midlands, chair of the National Academy of Social Prescribing. And until very recently, I was chair of the Academy of Medical Royal Colleges. But I just stepped down from that a few days ago, and I've been on holiday.
Yeah, so it was a 3-week gap, Helen, since our last recording. So we've allowed ourselves a week, and it is recess after all. Where have you been?
Oh, well, I took a week away in Cyprus. It was absolutely gorgeous, but crazy hot, as you can imagine. So ran away just for a week, but finally getting back into routine after that. So was on call in surgery yesterday, so that beat the holiday out to me very quickly.
Yeah, I bet it did. Do you see all that wildfire stuff on the news down in Rhodes and that?
It's absolutely horrific. I mean, the weather was scaldingly hot out in Cyprus, but we didn't have any of the awful problems with wildfires. But I just kept thinking to myself about the adverse impacts of global warming, how we all need to be taking this as a massive wake-up call, because several colleagues in surgery yesterday were talking about holidays they've got booked to places like Rhodes or Corfu or whatever, or their family have. And people are now genuinely frightened that it's impacting on us in a very real, tangible way. Anyone who's been affected by severe flooding or the fires we had in the UK in the last year has already faced this. But I think this is something really important for us in healthcare to be talking about in terms of prevention and what we talk about here on the podcast. I think we should be talking more about global warming, Steve, and the impact on health.
Oh, 100%. When you're on holiday, on a summer holiday, are you a good lounger person?
I didn't used to be. I used to be far too active, but I've got a lot better at lounging or splatting, as I call it. Splatted on a sun lounger.
Just laying. And does your other half do the same?
Yeah, I mean,
you're compatible.
We're compatible in that way. He tends to get impatient to do stuff more quickly than I do. It takes me about 4 days before I start to get restless, whereas he's usually after about 48 hours, he's kind of ready to do more. But the hot weather made us very compatible this time because you just couldn't do anything. We went out for one walk at 9:45 at night. And it was 29 centigrade and it was 89% humidity walking near the beach. That's sticky.
It won't surprise you to learn I am a nightmare on summer holidays and sit still for about 5 minutes before I'm bored. So basically like a 12-year-old boy. Anyway, last time, this is episode 11 of Prevention is the New Cure podcast. Last time on the pod, we were discussing the workforce plan, which seems ages ago, doesn't it? And it was the 75th birthday of the NHS, and we're talking a bit about Glastonbury. So thanks for your feedback on episode 10. Please remember to like the podcast on whichever platform you listen to it on. So there's been a lot going on, Helen, since we've been away. One story caught my eye last week. We'll talk about the pay deal in just a minute, but did you see that story about the transparent mouse could improve cancer drug tests? Did you see that?
I did. It was such a striking picture, wasn't it? But what a fascinating story.
So a new scanning method involving a see-through mouse could improve how cancer drugs are tested by picking up tumours previously too small to detect. So the Helmholtz Munich Research Center worked out how to make a dead mouse transparent back in 2018, and they've now used chemicals to highlight specific tissues so they can be scanned in unprecedented detail. So the wealth of potential that Cancer Research UK talked about is pretty obvious when it comes to some of the less survivable, less easy to detect cancers.
Yeah, I mean, the implications are that our scanning will be more effective if these techniques are used. But remember, this can only be done on dead tissue at the moment. You can't make a human invisible to scan them better. So this is all about research tool, not about use in humans. But I'm sure the application, like all great new technologies, the applications will be realized in the coming years. But it is exciting. It's nice to see something really interesting in this diagnostic space and really different.
Yeah, definitely. Well, if you're interested in more about this story, it's that the journal is called Nature Biotechnology. It's a sort of publication that you might see at the end of Have I Got News for You? But anyway, Nature Biotechnology is the publication. You can read all about the research, and I know people who listen to the pod like a little bit of detail on these things, so you can see that. Now, we've had quite a lot of industrial action, which doesn't really help with much healthcare related, prevention or otherwise. But we had 5-day junior doctor strikes as we last spoke, 2-day consultant strike when they were providing what they call emergency Christmas Day cover. And as we record this week's podcast, we've got the radiographers for the first time on a 2-day strike. So not going away, is it?
No, it's not, Steve. And I think there's a lot of sort of confusion out there as to what does this all mean, because in terms of, there've been big pay awards announced in the last few weeks. I mean, there was the big one in May, which was for all Agenda for Change staff. And then subsequently, we've had the pay award for people on the review body. So that's the Doctors and Dentists Review Board and the government has accepted the recommendations and said, you're having it and there's no more negotiation. There's no take it or leave it, it's take it. And that's quite a bold thing to have happened from government. And what's interesting is it doesn't seem to have had any impact at all on the passage of the strikes. I mean, I really wondered if this would now send everybody back to have conversations and negotiation, but it really doesn't seem to have happened. And that's obviously very frustrating for patients who are waiting for treatment and getting procedures cancelled. But it's also confusing for the rest of us in healthcare, wondering what's happening next. I'm a frontline GP. GPs haven't yet balloted on strike action, but I'm sure that's going to come at some point. So that's deeply difficult times for all of us.
Yeah, so the detail for those that like that. So most dentists and doctors are going to get at least a 6% pay rise. So junior doctors will be increased by around 8 to 9, just up near a 9%. So pay will be uplifted between 8% and just over 10%, depending on where they are in their training process. There's also an £1,800 payment uplift. So I was on the record at the time. I did quite a lot of media when this came out and said, I think this is fair, and I think it's fair to those that are working, and I think it's fair to the economy and to the rest of public services, which obviously government. I understand that the health unions obviously have to look at their members, and that's their job. Obviously, government has a much wider responsibility across the whole economy and has to do what's fair to taxpayers and with respect to inflation. So I do think it's fair. And I said that on the media. And, obviously I've had flack for that and I've had praise for that. But I do think now's the time to draw the line. And the teaching unions, I don't know whether you saw this, but the teaching unions obviously suspended their planned strikes as a result of this. And I know that the initial response from the BMA was, well, thanks very much. This is a good starting point. And on we go. I can tell you now from talking to Treasury, talking to my contacts at Number 10 in the department, this is not a starting point. They're done with the negotiation. This will now be imposed, as was the Agenda for Change. So I personally, I think that this is the beginning of the end, if not the end of this round of strikes. But key, and I said this in the House of Commons the other day, is that we have to get back to a situation where the government give the remit to the NHS pay bodies in the autumn. The work is then done over the turn of the year. It reports in January so that the Chancellor of the day can make the announcement on the pay award for the year to come in the spring budget. We've got away from that.
A long way from that.
Well, a long way from that. And that has led to a kind of pay drag, I think, which has meant that people do not have any concept or any hope, and let alone the employers have got any way of planning what their pay bill is going to be. So I think it is fair, Helen. And I hear, obviously I get it. It's not 35% that the junior doctors want. I get it. It's not.
It's so look, this point, can I just pick up on this latter point? So rather, I'm not going to pick up on the fairness or otherwise of the rest of it. I mean, you've articulated very clearly and views that is held by a lot of people, Steve. I mean, there's a lot of doctors and other healthcare professionals out there who won't be agreeing in terms of the quantum. But I think this point about the pay award bodies, all of the pay award bodies, not just the doctors' ones, obviously, I'm talking about the whole range of them. You referenced the teachers there as well. Absolutely, this has to be got back into a better timing cycle, because it's crazy at the moment. Nobody's got a certainty on budgets. And the situation we're in now is that the NHS has budgeted for and worked for a 3.5% pay rise. It's having to find a 6% pay rise for huge swathes of employees. I mean, actually, I think dentists are 5%. And I think with trainees, you're right. It's a consolidated extra payment that tops them up above the 6%. But where the heck's that money coming from? I mean, presumably ICBs and NHS England are scrabbling around frantically at the moment to find that extra 2.5% because they're not coming from Treasury. So it's going to come from other services, isn't it? And I think that's a problem.
Part of the pay rise is coming from reapportioning budgets. Part of it, they say, is coming from efficiencies. I mean, I've heard that before. Of course, you can't do them every single year.
But they were already factored in.
A big part of it is coming from a rise in the international health surcharge. Which hasn't gone up for a few years. So, I mean, again, I guess the question that we on the select committee will be asking is, how do you repeat that? Because you can't repeat that one every year either.
No, it's a one-off. And that's right. And and this lack of certainty is troublesome. I mean, obviously, from the general practice community point of view, there's been all this stuff has been said, but there's no certainty about what money is going to go to general practice, when it's going to be received. And so there's general practitioners up and down the country who are not on agenda, don't have staff on agenda for change, but all their staff have heard in the news, oh, you're going to get a pay rise. And they're working out how on earth we're going to fund this if the money is not coming through. And I think there's a lot, that uncertainty stokes further anxiety and it increases the chances of other parts of the sector getting dismayed. And I think this is troublesome. So yeah, you've hit something really important here. Bringing the planning cycle back into a sensible fiscal cycle would be a really good start. And I hope people listening can help make that happen.
Okay, should we take a quick break and then we'll come back and talk about measles?
Yay.
Welcome back. Helen, measles. You've got a bit of an outbreak where you are, but also big warnings in London recently.
Yeah, so I think most people will have picked up an awful lot of noise about measles in the last few weeks. London, big announcements last week from the UK Health Security Agency that they are predicting a very major outbreak because the level of immunity against measles is relatively low. And measles is one of the most infectious, easily transmittable infections that we have. And one of those diseases that, whilst a lot of people have a relatively mild dose of it, it can be fatal for some and have lots of long-term complications for others. And then following those announcements last week, just on Tuesday this week, as we're recording, we're hearing there's an outbreak in a school in Stoke-on-Trent, where so far 7 children have been confirmed with measles. But if 7 children have been confirmed with it, they're estimating there's quite a significant community circulation of disease already. Areas which have got high vaccination rates, so that's people that over 95% of the population vaccinated, it should die out very quickly. But in areas with lower vaccination rates, you're going to get these outbreaks, and that's going to lead to problems. So urging everybody, there's a free evergreen offer from the NHS, get vaccinated with MMR. This doesn't just apply to children and young people, but people who've never been exposed to these things. So people who were born in the 70s and 80s are eligible for MMR vaccination because they wouldn't have been vaccinated as children and they were less likely to be exposed to infections. So I don't know about you, Steve, but I was born in the 70s. We've had this conversation before. I wouldn't have had MMR, but I didn't have measles as a child. I remember having chickenpox and I remember having German measles as a child, but I certainly didn't get measles. And so I took up the offer of an MMR vaccine several years ago when the offer was made, because I'm conscious, I work with a public.
Did you?
I did, yeah.
Late.
I did.
Yeah, I think I had it. Yeah, I think I had it when I was meant to have it. But can I ask you, what is the connection? Because there's a big TV campaign at the moment about shingles, and shingles and measles. They're viral infections, right? That can be fatal. But shingles is more connected to chickenpox in
correct. So
they are pediatric years, right?
Yeah, so that's correct. So chickenpox is a different virus from measles. It's a totally different illness. But chickenpox invariably strikes in childhood. You get massive outbreaks of it, and isn't quite as infectious, isn't quite as dangerous as measles, but still pretty miserable when you get it. The key thing with chickenpox is once you've had chickenpox, a certain amount of, I feel like, viral memory, for want of a more scientific description, remains in your system, and at a later point can be reactivated in just single nerve pathways called dermatomes or stripes of nerves, and that can be reactivated to form shingles. So you can only get shingles if at some point you had chickenpox in the past.
I see.
Which the vast majority of people have. Having a shingles vaccine can help protect older people, particularly from serious or severe bouts of shingles, because shingles for the first time can be viciously painful, very distressing condition. And depending on where the nerve that's affected is, if it's across your face, affecting your eye, or it's affecting the genital area, it can be really troublesome and lead to lots of complications. So shingles vaccination program is actually about to expand. So I'm glad you mentioned that. It's only been announced in the last few days. Formerly, people between the ages of 70 and 79 were being offered vaccination. It's going to drop the age to 65 upwards, I think. And it's going to now become a 2-stage vaccine, a different vaccine, but a more effective one. And people will be offered 2 vaccines rather than just the one. So, yeah, that's another one. And all these
it's all good. I mean, vaccination, of course, somebody told me, other than clean water is the biggest public health intervention, preventative intervention we can make.
Ultimate prevention.
The Select Committee this week actually just publishing a report on our vaccination work stream within the prevention inquiry that we're doing, and the headlines are that the UK risks losing its position as the global leader on vaccination, and the reason for that is poor uptake and pretty low levels of industrial clinical trial activity in the UK are the reason for the warning. So, you know, England,
we can fix both those.
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, we looked specifically at England as the House of Commons Select Committee. So, England didn't meet the 95% target for routine child immunisation, any of them, in 21-22. We're the only nation in the UK where coverage for all childhood vaccinations at all ages was below the target, and coverage rates were consistently below the UK average. So, that's why you saw the warning from the UK Health Security Agency. You mentioned about London. MMR rates remain low. That's why you've seen the measles spike in London and in the West Midlands. And you know, we're making quite a lot of recommendations to government around access, around the vaccination workforce, and for the government to, NHS England and the government to publish this vaccination immunisation strategy, which they've been talking about. We need to see that. So
you definitely do.
You know, have a look out for that if you're interested in that on the Select Committee website and social media.
And Steve, there are some really important things about making it as easy as possible for people to find trustworthy information at their fingertips, whichever way they want to find it, and making access to vaccination at times and places that suit them as easy as possible. Because so much of the problem we have with vaccination isn't people who are anti-vaccination. That's actually a very small population. It's this sort of antipathy, not, you know, a bit sort of meh about the whole thing. And actually, if we make it as easy as possible and we're as positive as possible, we're more likely to increase uptake. So,
well, I think I've said before that, you know, there's very different in it between being anti-vax and being cut out of various parts of healthcare. So if you have poor dental health or poor sexual health, it wouldn't be greatly surprising that you would have poor vaccine health as well, because you're outside, aren't you? You're a bit you're part, it's part of the inequalities in healthcare. On that, just before we introduce our guests, plural, big story this week that's running across all the media is a piece of work that's been put out by the Health Foundation. The number of people living with major illnesses in England will rise 9 times faster than the healthy working age population. By 2040, nearly 1 in 5 will have health conditions such as dementia and cancer, up from 1 in 6 in 2019. And the Health Foundation's work is saying that this population shift will have a major impact on the NHS, and that points to the need to the major condition strategy and the need to prevent these major conditions, diabetes, anxiety, cancer, atrial fibrillation, heart failure, CPD. You know, my goodness, is this music to our ears in some ways, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's another fantastic publication by the Health Foundation, who one of the big think tanks who always turn out incredible quality work. And I think what's interesting for me, Steve, is, you know, this is not just a UK or an England phenomena. This is a phenomena that's recognised across all the sort of, you know, more affluent nations. An aging population, if you're aging and you've got a reasonably good healthcare system, people, as they're going to get older, are going to live longer to develop more long-term conditions. But as we've talked many times before, there are so many things we can do about helping people live the healthiest lives they can, so that we delay the onset of disease. You know, we prevent where we can, and when we treat in ways as early as we can, so we minimize the, you know, all the damage that can be done by these long-term conditions. However, we also need to be planning for this for the future. So you mentioned the long-term condition strategy. We're eagerly awaiting that. Hopefully by the next episode, we'll be talking about the interim report from them. And the full report for that's due out in the winter. But I think this is something we all need to be deeply concerned about. This isn't actually a shock. This is what's been predicted for the last 10 years or so, the demographic time bomb in healthcare. But good to see it laid out so clearly yet again.
Yeah, it says 80%, 2 million people of the projected increase in major illnesses will affect people aged 70 and over as the baby boomers reach old age and life expectancy increases. So, you just look around your doctor's waiting room, and then consider this. You can see the pressure it's going to put on the NHS, which probably leads very nicely into our guests. So let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll introduce them.
Welcome back, everybody. I am so excited to be introducing our next two guests. So unusually, Steve, we've got two guests today, and I'm going to give you a double dose of Davids. First of all, it's Professor Sir David Haslam, who is one of my GP all-time heroes. One of the people who helped me by giving me great advice at useful points in time to make some good career choices. And the second David, Professor David Pendleton, who I first got to know because of his legendary work about GP consulting, the Pendleton rules, but who I've come to know as a friend over the years. I'm going to let the pair of you introduce yourselves properly, chaps, but I just want you to know it's great to have you here and lovely to be working with you again. David Haslam first.
Wow, I mean, who can argue with an introduction like that? Thanks ever so much, Helen. Real pleasure to be with you both today. Real honour. I'm David Haslam, lifetime as a general practitioner, 36 years in Cambridgeshire as a GP, ending up in a lot of leadership roles in the health service. Primarily at the end of my career, sort of 6 years as chair of NICE, which was an absolutely fascinating insight into some of the big questions around healthcare.
And David P.
I'm David Pendleton. I'm a psychologist by background. Did a lot of work with general practitioners around the time of my doctorate and for the few years afterwards. Been a great fan of general practice and of the Royal College of GPs for many, many years. And now I'm professor in leadership at Henley Business School, and thereby hangs a tale which we'll tell you, no doubt, as the conversation progresses.
Brilliant. That's so great to have you both on. Thank you for coming. And David H., I believe you you must be retired because you said you listened to the podcast.
that doesn't automatically follow. I certainly do listen to the podcast as I walk my children's dogs. We seem to spend an inordinate amount of time looking after my son and daughter's dogs, which is fabulous, and love podcasts then. And of course, I'd be really interested to know how your dog, Monty, is, because he's such a star of this podcast.
Yeah, well, I'm in London today recording, and my son, we had that joyous moment at 6 a.m. this morning when my son, who's 12, came down and said, "I feel sick," and then I'm going to be sick, and so he's at home sick. So I phoned home earlier, David, to check how the boys, so William, my son, and Monty the dog are, and to which my wife said, "William's been sick 3 times and Monty's eating ants." So I that's the best update I can give you on Monty today, but the mind boggles. The boy's sick and the other one's eating ants. What a pleasure. Adds a whole new meaning to ants in your pants.
But that's actually, I think, worse than apples under the desk. So, apples under the desk were a trip hazard, but that was about all. Anyway, we should be talking about other stuff. You have been up to some amazing work. And David, your book has come out recently, which has created quite a stir.
Well, yes, my book, which the title Side Effects, How Our Healthcare Lost Its Way and How We Fix It, I was delighted, came out to really fantastic reviews. I was absolutely delighted with its reception when it came out last year, coming out August the 3rd in paperback. I'm not going to miss the opportunity to say that.
Quick, he's got his plug in.
And fundamentally, I was trying to have a look at the whole question of what healthcare's trying to do, because it seems to me there's this extraordinary disconnect between what some of the stated aspirations are for healthcare and actually what happens. We for instance, the really simple one, we claim we want to reduce health inequalities, we want to improve health outcomes. The best way of doing that is focusing in primary care. Well, instead, we tended over the last 10 years or so to let primary care sort of wither on the vine, whilst huge amounts of money have gone into other sectors. And I've been intrigued by that disconnect and wanted to explore that a bit.
David P., did you want to, I mean, you've been doing a lot of thinking in this space as well.
Well, yes, the Henley Centre for Leadership I've nudged into allowing David Haslam and I to co-chair a think tank on the future of the health service, prompted initially by the publication of David's book and a conversation that he and I had had many, many years ago. We just thought we'd pick it up. And so we invited 12 extremely impressive people to come and join us. And we debated the future of the health service for about 2 days and came to some, I think, quite interesting conclusions, ones that I think are worth hearing, worth debating, and worth defending, which I'm prepared to spend some time with you on today, if there's time.
Go for it.
Well, I think the key word in all of our thinking became the notion of resetting. That what had happened is, over 75 years, the health service started out in a particular direction to try and enable the health of the nation, but became a sickness service, and really became a sickness service focused in hospitals, which are an expensive part of a whole kind of healthcare provision for a nation, and a bit left the funding behind in both social and primary and community care. And we believe that this system has become out of balance, and that what's needed at the 75th anniversary is a reboot, is a reset. And by that, we mean we need a short period of intense funding, yes, extra new funding. That'll be as popular as anything, of course, in times of austerity. But we need about 5 years to reset this system, we think, and allow it to become a proper health service that's primarily disproportionately funded around primary care.
Steve, what do you think?
Fascinating. I love the title of your book. There's one of the reviews says, let's guess whose review this is. This insightful, extensively referenced work has taken the hugely complex challenges of the provision of universal state-funded healthcare in a sustainable way and unpicked them thoughtfully. I was absorbed from the outset, brackets, on my sun lounger in Cyprus. Do you know who that was? Do you know who said that?
Steve, stop being naughty.
Oh, it's Helen. So I think one of the reasons why we started this podcast is because healthcare expenditure, what did the ONS say? It's about 11, just over 11% of gross domestic product last year, and that's lower than it was, about a percentage point lower than it was the year before. And that reduction is caused because the growth in expenditure on healthcare is being outpaced by the growth in the overall economy. In other words, we're increasing spending on health faster than our economy is growing. And when I ran for the chair of the Select Committee, and we started the podcast shortly after that, I was saying, we can't have it's not a sustainable situation where we are growing healthcare funding faster than the economy is growing. And therefore, either we stem the rising tide of demand, which is outstripping supply, or something very, very bad is going to happen. The system's going to fall over. And so I guess the question is, are you talking structural, or are you talking financial, or are you talking both? As Alan Milburn used to say, investment and reform.
Yeah, I think it is investment and reform, inevitably. We very much sort of developed the analogy that you can almost see the health system as, imagine a bookshelf full of really good books like mine, and which is where so you've got the acute hospitals tend to be the books, and if you haven't got an effective set of bookends, the whole lot tumbles over. And we thought the bookends are primary care at one end, where there's this extraordinary capacity for handling risk, uncertainty, not avoiding over medicalization, avoiding over treatment, and then at the other bookend, to stop the whole system falling over, is social care, which again has been totally underinvested in. And the reason we got the concept of the reset, it's almost turn it off and turn it on again, which obviously you can't do, but is the fact that the acute care is where the noise always is, and where the noise is politically attracts the money. I mean, at the moment, obviously, there's noise in general practice because people are very unhappy about access to general practice. But it's always the more expensive, the more glamorous situations where the money gets taken to, totally understandably, which then underinvests in those two bookends, and the books fall over. The system falls over, which is very much where we are at the moment.
But here's the weird thing, right? So as a constituency MP, so I have 75,000 constituents. I get it. And you say in one of the pieces I read of your work is that obviously the media, MPs in particular, are always excited by the bricks and mortars of their hospitals. But where the action is politically and the media action right now is around access to general practice. So it's not as if that's the Cinderella service that gets like sexual health services that's being overlooked. There has never been more talk about access to general practice. But are you saying that that's just talk then because the funding is not following the talk?
Well, I'm looking back. I mean, Steve, as well as I do, what the workforce numbers have been over the last sort of 10, 15 years, where we've seen the number of hospital specialists escalate really quite dramatically, and the number of GPs plummeting. So the talk's been there, but actually, whatever the action that is required to address this just doesn't seem to have happened. The other problem with prevention, of course, which is, I think, a fundamental part of both your podcast and the role of general practice, is there's no story. You know, if you don't, if the tragedy is what if you have a heart attack treated effectively, there's a wonderful story. There's a really good news thing. I bet you and I would infinitely rather not have a heart attack than have it treated effectively. But there's no story, there's no name. Even the person who doesn't have the heart attack doesn't know they haven't had a heart attack. There's nothing there as a narrative, and so we've pretended. Whatever the rhetoric has been about primary care, the actions have been in the other direction, as we can see from what's happened with the workforce.
And obviously, we talked about the workforce plan in our last episode. I'm going to bring David Pendleton back in before I perhaps throw a few questions at you. But David P., what are you thinking right now?
I'm thinking that I was looking at the Institute for Fiscal Studies report. In a nutshell, what it shows is that in hospitals, you've got more healthcare workers treating fewer patients, and in general practice, you've got fewer healthcare workers treating more patients. And that's a real problem to be sustainable. But the other thing I was thinking is that whatever the costs of any kind of reset and reboot that we're proposing, and we know that there will be considerable, there are two factors, I think, that are worth taking into account. The first is that between 2010 and 2020, the estimate is that our nation spent something like 40 billion a year less than the equivalent spending would have been in the other wealthy nations around Europe. And we think that it's time for a reset, a reboot. Let's imagine we could get half of that. We just want to get half of it back to reset the system and make it fit for the future rather than fit for the past. We don't want to have a fine future behind us. And the second thing I was thinking is that think about the costs in other terms too. What we've got at the moment is enormous costs being paid, firstly by folks working in the health service who are working their socks off and getting criticised all the time. And the second is by 7.5 million people waiting for treatment. You know, those are costs as well. This system is not working. Something needs to change.
And there's also other costs, which the whole impact on the economy of huge numbers of people not working at the moment because of long-term conditions and so on. So we always tend to talk about the cost of the health service as money out. And I don't have to tell you guys this, it's the amazing impact it has on UK PLC from a production and from a workforce perspective as well. It's, a real positive asset as well as a negative cost.
And
lack of money in.
Yes. Yeah. So certainly, yes, I was on call in surgery on Monday this week, and I had a pretty, pummeling day, as one always does. But I was struck by the challenges of people on waiting lists and their economic activity during that process. I signed somebody off, and I signed them off for, in the first instance, for 4 weeks. And I think you're going to be off for 3 or 4 months before the system manages to sort out all the new health problems we've just uncovered in you in the last couple of days. And it was one of those moments of, oh my gosh, this is a high-performing individual, and I'm just taking them away from their work, which is the right thing to do. And the relief on the face was enormous when I said it and signed off the fit note. But it was and if we could get them back to work faster, the whole system would benefit. Anyway, Steve, I'm conscious we've been going on for a while. What's on your mind? What are your reflections? Big sums of money are scary together.
I mean, I think I was talking to the Chancellor earlier today about various things. I mean, he is acutely, if you listen to what he said in the budget, he is acutely aware of the financial cost of ill health. And, I'm always talking to him, as you would expect me to, about the cost of not preventing ill health. But if we talk Turkey on the figures, right? So 25 years ago, just after Blair came into office, the Department of Health in England spent about 36.5 billion quid So it's about £60 billion in today's prices. Today, the department's planned spending, excluding the COVID specials, is around £165 billion. So that's a real terms increase of 180%. And they're pretty accurate figures. So I guess the question that I always have as a parliamentarian, as a constituency MP whose constituents are taxed to pay for this, because government doesn't have any money, it only ever comes from the taxpayer, is how much more is enough? And where do we get it from? Because remember, Boris Johnson, to his credit, not often I say those words, he put in a 1% national insurance rise to pay for a COVID catch-up and then B, the social care policy. And there was a huge hullabaloo. And then Liz Truss got rid of it. And there was big support across the governing party and actually out in the country to get rid of that tax rise. So is this just another case the public want sort of European levels of spending, but they don't want to pay for it?
I mean, my challenge back is about the alternatives. And I think what the two Davids are articulating is that if we don't do something radical, if we don't take this moment in time to do things big and differently, then we ain't going to have a health system that we can recognize in 5 to 10 years' time. And I think that's what resonated with me when I read the work that the pair of you have come up with.
Can I also say, Steve, the answer to your question, what's enough? It's an interesting one because it sounds increasingly like a kind of very specific question that there should be an answer to. And I don't think there is. I think it's a rhetorical question. The truth is we don't know what enough is. But what we do know is what insufficient is. And that's where we are at the moment.
And part of the reason I wrote my book is I've been lucky enough to sort of visit a large number of countries around the world, particularly when I was chair of NICE, and talk to health ministers in all sorts of countries and hear them facing exactly the same problems, whatever their healthcare system is. All these debates about let's dump the NHS and have social insurance or whatever. Well, it's the same problem everywhere. And I felt some of these issues come down to a lack of clarity of what we're really trying to achieve. I think the reports in today's media about the extraordinary numbers of patients with citizens with multiple health problems in years to come. This becomes an ever more challenging issue. And the point at which we're over-medicalizing and a lot of aspects of everyday life seems to me to be a universal, an international issue, not just an issue for the NHS, which is why I was really keen to get this discussed.
And it's so interesting that you talk about the international perspective, because, I traveled a bit as a health minister and, G7, G20 meetings with my NHS badge on. And it's so fascinating how many of my opposite numbers from around the world would talk to me in glowing terms about the NHS, which I didn't necessarily hear domestically from some sections of political life. But they were always envious of our primary care system. They were always envious of that GP system. And, I always think we need to talk that down at our peril, because it really is the golden goose. But the sense I get from your work is that you think it's the golden goose that's not being fed properly.
Well, I do. And I also have this absolute terror that it's going the same way as dentistry, and it'll be it becomes a poor service for poor people while everyone else goes private.
Yeah.
It's absolutely the last thing. That would be a disaster.
So before we close, if each of you were to give us, your two golden bullets in terms of, preventing ill health, where would you look? Is it population level? Is it secondary prevention? What are the two golden threads that you think we should look at when it comes to preventing?
Well, there is, without a doubt, there's an issue of individual responsibility, and it's quite tricky to get into this whilst understanding the whole social determinants of health issue. But the Wanless report all those years ago talked about the need for a fully joined up, scenario where the public is involved in their healthcare, and we just haven't got there, and that's going to be critical. But we also have to support people for whom that is a major challenge.
David P.
Yeah, I'm professor of leadership, and I want to make a point about leadership at this point to close. Great. Because my sense is, that my definition of leadership is the job of the leader is to create the conditions for people to succeed. And at the moment, we're not creating the right conditions for primary care to succeed. We're not investing enough in it. We're not giving it prominence enough, and we're not enabling them, GPs, to enable health and well-being in the population as a whole. That's a really critical and dumb mistake, and we're making it right now as a nation.
Thank you. Beautifully said, the pair of you. Steve, I think we're out of time.
Absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much to the Davids, the double D. I was going to tell a story about when David Davis stood against David Cameron and we had T-shirts with double D on, but it went horribly wrong. So let's leave it there. David Haslam's book, which you can find on all good sellers, is called Side Effects, How Our Healthcare Lost Its Way and How We Fix It. Looks like a really interesting book. So you can find that. And David Pendleton, you can find some of your writings, I think, through the Henley Business School, which, so if you Google Professor David Pendleton, you will find that. We're really grateful, aren't we, Helen? Really grateful to have your guys on.
Such a privilege to have the conversation with you both and to hear you articulate what we've seen in writing. So thank you for your time. And we look forward to continuing the conversations. And I really hope this has stimulated some thought in other people, because quite frankly, if we don't grab this moment, we will all be living to regret it.
Indeed. And we've had a bit of an AGM of the podcast today, because obviously we've now into double digit in terms of, this is episode 11. I think. And we've got so many people who want to come on the podcast. We've got some really interesting guests lined up in the weeks ahead. You can email us, podcast@stevebryan.com. You can find us on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Threads. The new thing, soon to be Threads. Soon to be Threads, him sounding terribly with it. But you can find us on all those platforms. Please engage. Tell us what you'd like us to talk about. Pose questions for the pod surgery, because that doorbell will be back. And until next time, thank you to the Davids. It's a pleasure to see you, Helen. Welcome back from your holiday.
Thank you.
And we'll speak soon.
Yeah, take care all. Stay safe. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.